You may have been handed a broken way of reading the book of Revelation, a way of reading it that feeds fear and anxiety and confuses more than offers peace or hope or anything else. If you're like a lot of Christians that I know, when you get to the book of Revelation, you just don't know what to do with it. So maybe you rush through it as fast as you can because you know you're supposed to read the whole Bible, or maybe you just skip it because you figure, I'm not going to be able to make heads or tails of it anyway. What's the point? And yet that's not why Revelation is in our Bible. And once we understand the kind of book it is, it changes everything. And we start to see that Revelation, rather than being a book filled with anxiety and fear, is actually one of the most hopeful and encouraging books in the entire Bible. Hey, I'm Casey, and this is Living Theology. And on this episode, we are going to look at what the book of Revelation actually is. I want to offer you a way of understanding and reading this book that will change the way you understand it forever. And not only will it make a whole lot more sense, but it will also become practical and applicable. Instead of just being a book that is confusing and something that you sort of skip over or don't really know what to do with, or feel like you have to go read the news in order to understand, when you understand what kind of book this was intended to be, it becomes a book you can actually read. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably wondering about the mark of the beast and the tribulation and the rapture and the millennium and all of those things, and we will get to all of that. We will look at every one of those issues. But before we can understand any of those things, we have to take a step back and make sure we actually know what kind of book this is. Because if we are expecting a straightforward prophecy of the final years leading up to Christ's return, and it's actually something different, then we are going to misunderstand it completely. So, what kind of book is Revelation? Well, in order to understand that, we have to take a step back and say, what does Revelation tell us about itself? And if you read it, you'll find out that in the very first chapter, it tells us that it is addressed to the 7 churches in Asia, which were actual churches and actual cities where, in what we call today Turkey, and that the things recorded there were to take place soon, or shortly they were to come to pass, that the time was at hand. And so it seems that this piece of apocalyptic literature was written to the first century Christians who were living in the Roman Empire, and in particular in this area called Asia. Now, if we don't consider that after we get past chapter 1 or 2 or 3, we are going to misunderstand because we will lack important context. It reminds me a little of this classic sitcom trope, the misheard conversation. A character overhears just half of a conversation. Somebody's talking on the phone and they can only hear the one part of the phone conversation, and because of that, they totally misinterpret what's being said. There's a classic example in I Love Lucy where Lucy hears her husband Ricky talking on the phone and discussing some woman that works for him, and she thinks that he is plotting to have her, his wife, murdered. But that's not at all what's taking place. She's just misheard the conversation because she doesn't have the context. I think that we are kind of doing this with the book of Revelation. That we are assuming that it was written to us as 21st century Christians. We are neglecting the actual context, and we are reading a lot of things into it that just aren't there. It's just important to understand that for all of church history, it was not assumed that Revelation was all going to take place in the future. In fact, one of the more popular ways of reading Revelation before dispensationalism came along was the belief that Revelation was actually a history, a kind of future-telling history of the church from Pentecost till Christ's return, and that it included all of history between Pentecost and Christ's return. And so this way of reading Revelation as if it's all in the future was not a just given. There are other ways of understanding it. And I think that if we start with the context, we actually have a totally different way of understanding it that makes way more sense of it. So if we're going to understand the book of Revelation, the first thing we have to understand is that Revelation is what's called apocalyptic literature. It's a kind of writing that was really popular in Jewish circles during the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I'll get into it in a future video. We'll look at all the details of what apocalyptic literature was and how it worked, and maybe even some other examples of it, like the book of Enoch and others. For now, all that you really need to know is that apocalyptic literature was written to people who were suffering, who were oppressed, things were not going their way. And they were living in the promise of God. They believed God was going to come through, that he was going to fulfill some promises, that he was going to make all things new, that he was going to right every wrong, that he was going to judge the wicked and restore the righteous. They believed that, but when they looked around them, they saw a world that did not reflect that it seemed like God was kind of absent, that he wasn't doing what they were expecting. And so they were tempted to feel like maybe God has forgotten his promises, or maybe his promises weren't true. Maybe we were wrong about God. And apocalyptic literature was written to sort of pull back the curtain and say, this is how God is at work, even in the midst of all of this chaos and of all of these trials and of all of these bad things. In fact, that's what the word apocalyptic, that's where it comes from. It comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means an unveiling or an uncovering. It's not a word that means catastrophe or disaster. It means the curtain is being pulled back. And by pulling it back, we're saying, you may not be able to see how God is at work, but God is at work. Revelation, if we understand that Revelation was written with that in mind, it was written to suffering Christians living in the first century in Asia. These were Christians who were being told that Caesar was Lord, not Jesus. These were Christians who were being told that the Roman Empire was the one to bring peace and safety and security. These were Christians who were being told that they needed to make offerings and worship Caesar because he was the one who sat on the throne. And as they experienced this, and Jesus' second coming seemed far off, they needed encouragement and they needed hope that God had not abandoned his people, and that just as Christ was raised, they would be raised too, and that all things would be made new, just as Isaiah and Jesus had promised. So if that's the case, then what is Revelation? Is it really a book that was intended to tell about the last years leading up to Jesus' return? Is that what these Christians in the first century needed? No. Revelation is a cosmic gospel. A cosmic gospel. Now you may say, what are you talking about? Like, what does that even mean? Here's the way I like to think about it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John describe the gospel from an earthly human perspective, right? We see the angel come to Mary in her home. We see Joseph have a dream in his home. We see them, go to Bethlehem, and Jesus is born in a manger, and the Magi come, and Herod tries to kill him, and they escape to Egypt, and they come back, and Jesus has this earthly ministry over the course of these 3 or so years around Galilee and Jerusalem, and he goes to Bethany, he goes to these cities, and he heals, the blind and lepers, and he casts out demons, and he goes to the cross, and he hangs on the cross, and he dies on that third day, and he's resurrected, and he appears to the disciples, and he teaches them, and all of this happens. And when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we get this whole gospel from a human perspective. But when we read the book of Revelation, we see the same story and its effects from an eternal cosmic perspective. It's like reading the gospel from God's perspective. It's like the curtain has been pulled back, and we don't just see the physical earth and dirt and the cross and the blood, but we see what happened through the gospel in the spiritual realm. Okay, so let me just give you a couple of examples so that you understand what I mean by Revelation being a cosmic gospel, okay, a cosmic retelling of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the effects of the gospel. Revelation 2 and 3 opens with these 7 letters written to these actual 7 churches that are in Asia. And then we come to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, John is brought into the throne room of God. Now, this is setting the stage for the entire book of Revelation. And where is he? He is in the throne room of God. He is seeing things from God's perspective, from an eternal, heavenly perspective. And if you read chapter 4, it is all of creation. It's the angels all worshiping the Creator God, bowing down to him. And then we come to chapter 5, and here's the way that it opens. It says, I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne, that's God the Father, a book written inside and on the back, sealed up with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the book and to break its seals? And no one in heaven or on the earth or under the earth was able to open the book or to look into it. Then I began to weep greatly because no one was found worthy to open the book or to look into it. So here John is in the throne room of God. He's in the presence of God. And there is this book. The book is the will and the purpose of God. God has a plan for all of creation. And what he's saying is that when he sees the purpose of God, there is no human creature that can carry out the purpose of God. Listen, this is the entire story of the Old Testament. The entire story of the Old Testament is the story of God having a purpose to fulfill, a will that he wants carried out, and no one in creation, no one in heaven or on the earth or under the earth is able to open the book or to look into it. The purposes and the will of God can't be carried out by any creature. And so John sees this playing out in this cosmic way, and he begins to weep. And then we read that one of the elders says, "Stop weeping. Behold, the Lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has overcome so as to open the book and its 7 seals." In other words, Christ, God the Son, the fulfillment of all of the hopes of the world, finally steps up, and he is going to fulfill what no creature in all of the Old Testament possibly could. And he turns around, and rather than seeing the Lion of Judah, he sees a lamb slain. This is the opening act of the book of Revelation. And what is it? It is the gospel. That the purposes of God needed to be fulfilled, and that no created being could fulfill them, but Christ has come to fulfill them. He is the worthy one who was crucified and who has been raised. That is the gospel, and it is the opening picture that Revelation gives us. That should give us a hint that Revelation is all about the gospel. Let me give you one more example, and this one may be a little more tangible, a little bit easier to understand. You probably know the story of Jesus's birth when the Magi come to Herod, who's the king of Judea. They ask him about, they say that they've seen a star in the east and they've come to worship this new king of Israel. And so Herod hears this, and immediately it makes him very nervous because he's the king and he doesn't want to give up his throne. And so he plots to kill Jesus before he can even begin his ministry. Fortunately, God intervenes and warns Joseph and Mary, and they take Jesus and head down to Egypt and then remain there until Herod is dead, and then an angel tells them, and they come back to Galilee, settle in Nazareth. Now, that is the earthly perspective. That's the earthly story. The spiritual story, what was really happening in the spiritual realm, is recorded in Revelation chapter 12. Same events, but Matthew is from a human perspective. Revelation 12 is from the divine perspective. So what do we see here? It says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. and she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Now, there's a lot of debate about who this woman is. Personally, I think this woman represents the people of God, but I don't want to get into that right now. We'll talk about it maybe in another video. If you're interested, you can let me know. It says, but here's what we do know, that there's a woman and she's about to have a child, and we find out down in verse 5, it says she gave birth to its son, a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. This is obviously Jesus. We know this because this is a direct reference to Psalm 2, which is a messianic psalm about the Son of God ruling the nations with an iron rod. So this child is Jesus. Now, she's about to give birth, back to verse 2, and here's what we read in verse 3. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Okay? So what is going on here? This is what happened both, I would argue, with Herod and with the Roman Empire. When Christ comes into the world, he is birthed into the world to fulfill his calling, to rule over the nations. And what does the dragon do? Well, the dragon, by the way, is Satan. We're told that twice in the book of Revelation. What does the dragon do? He works through political powers like Herod and like Pilate to try and put a stop to God's purposes in the world, who try to put a stop to the gospel. It is Satan who is behind the plot of Herod. It is Satan who was at work to bring Christ to the cross. Now, he didn't know that he was actually fulfilling what God was working out. But in the spiritual realm, what we see in Revelation 12 is that the dragon, or Satan, is actually trying to work through all of these political entities to put a stop to the purposes of God that Christ was working out. So John pulls back the curtain, and we are given a glimpse at the spiritual reality that is behind those gospel stories and the impact that the gospel made. Now, I could go into a lot more of the book of Revelation, and we could look at a lot of these different passages and see how this applies, how Revelation pulls back the curtain and helps us to see the spiritual reality of what was taking place in the natural world in the Gospels. But Revelation also, it doesn't just give us a one-to-one correspondence of this happened in the gospel or in the life of Jesus or in what God was doing through Christ, and this is how it's represented in the book of Revelation. I would argue that Revelation doesn't just show us the gospel in a cosmic scale, but it also shows us the effects of the gospel. That the gospel leads to the renewal of all creation, that the gospel leads to judgment, that the gospel leads to all of these other things, and we see these from a divine perspective laid out in the book of Revelation. These are the same events from 2 different angles. Now, when we start to read Revelation in this way, when we say, I'm going to read this not as a prophecy that may or may not happen in the next 10, 20, 30, 100, 1,000 years, who knows? But instead, I'm going to read this book as if it is a retelling of the gospel and its effects, as if it is a cosmic gospel. When we begin to read it this way, the book of Revelation comes alive, and we see that this is a book that offers us encouragement and hope and a greater vision of what God is doing in the world than we ever could have imagined. It helps us have a much more robust theology of worship and of the future and of the spiritual realm and of all of those things. And it allows us to see things from a different perspective, because now we understand, yes, the serpent, the dragon, Satan, he's at work behind the scenes. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. But guess what? God is going to make all things new. And even in those moments where it feels like nothing is going right and we're facing trial after trial, Revelation reminds us that God is working behind the scenes through every single thing. through every difficult time, through every trial, through every problem. I mean, think about this from just an ordinary week, right? When we start to read Revelation as a cosmic gospel and we see news that things are not going well, we don't have to panic because Revelation has reminded us that God is reigning and that He is making all things new and that every wicked thing will be judged and made right. Even when we face difficult people or problems, Revelation gives us a divine perspective and reminds us that God has everything under control. When we gather for worship on Sunday morning, Revelation gives us a vision of worship that is so much bigger than just the little congregation that we inhabit. And we are reminded that we are joining our voices, that our praise is being lifted not just with the people immediately in the room, but with the heavenly hosts and with all of creation, that we are joining in a heavenly worship. See, when we understand what Revelation is, that it is a cosmic gospel, it offers us a way of seeing the world that we're now inhabiting, not just a forecast for the future. Now, it's important to recognize that this doesn't mean Revelation says nothing about the future. Yes, Christ does return. That hasn't happened yet. Yes, there is a new creation. Yes, God is going to judge and make right every wrong. All of that is true. But the purpose of Revelation is not to offer us a coded timeline of events leading up to Christ's return. Instead, it is a book that unveils who is reigning right now so that we are able to live into the future completely unafraid. It offers real hope, not just optimism or, sort of living in denial, but it offers us the kind of hope that says, yes, bad things happen. Satan is on the prowl, but God is greater and He is ruling and He is reigning right now. It's a book that ultimately reminds us that this world and that Satan and that hell and the grave and sin, none of those things have the last word. But God and God alone have the last word. The Lamb, He has the last word. The Lamb who was slain is worthy. That is the book of Revelation. That is what it's all about. And over the next several weeks, that's what I want for us to read together. That we would read this book not as a forecast about all the things that might happen, not as something that creates fear about microchips and barcodes and the beast and Black Hawk helicopters and all of the stuff that's coming for you and just waiting out until the rapture happens so we can get swept away, but instead that we would read it with hope, knowing that God is making all things new and that He is working behind the scenes of everything right now. That is a much better, more faithful, contextual reading of the book of Revelation. That's what I hope to do with you. And so if you want to join in the conversation, I hope that you do. Please leave me a comment. How did you grow up reading the book of Revelation? And if anything that I've said has been helpful or encouraging, or if you just want to follow the journey, maybe you want to see whatever train wreck you feel like this is, then please subscribe and hit the bell notification so that we can walk on this path together, and hopefully you'll walk away with a better understanding of Revelation, and maybe you'll help me understand it a little bit better as well. So we'll see you next time on Living Theology.